Jesus walked about 20 miles in a day. So the area of Tyre and Sidon was roughly a 2-day journey, or one if you walked really fast and quite a lot. Now, the Old Testament mentions Israel's dealings with these cities, including the Israelites' failure to conquer Sidon in their conquest of the Promised Land. And if you want to read about that one, that's in Judges chapter 1 and 31. It also talks about their worship of the Sidonian gods on several occasions, and their obtaining materials from Sidon and Tyre for the building of the temple. Also, King Hiram of Tyre provided many of the temple's furnishings for Solomon as he built the temple. And the people from Tyre and Sidon are also mentioned in helping rebuild the temple in Ezra's time. So there's a history, if you like, between Tyre and Sidon and Israel. And on top of that, the Sidonian city of Zarephath is where the widow took care of Elijah, and the Lord provided her with oil and flour. And later, if you remember, the widow's son became ill, and Elijah raised him from the dead. So even though at the time of Jesus these two cities were not actually part of Judah, there is history between those cities and Judah. So these were two Gentile cities. Let's look back a minute now to chapter 11 and verses 21 and 22 in Matthew's Gospel. And it says this: "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, it will be more bearable for Tyre and Sidon on the day of judgment than for you." That's a pretty damning indictment for Judah cities, to be compared to Philistine, to pagan cities. And Jesus indicating that it's going to be more bearable for them on the day of judgment than for their own people. So not only are these two cities, Tyre and Sidon, Gentile cities, they had a reputation for being evil and ungodly. Now, experts are divided as to whether or not Jesus actually did visit the cities or not, or whether he was just in the vicinity of them. They can't make their mind up whether he went right into the cities or just stepped over the border a little way into the general area. Pulpit commentary says this: "These two cities lay on the coast of Galilee and had never been really conquered by the Israelites, though allotted to the tribe of Asher. There was no very exact limitation of territory between Phoenicia, of which these were the capitals, and the Jewish land, but there was a great moral distinction. The Phoenicians were sunk in the grossest idolatry. The worship of Baal and Ashtaroth reigned among them with all its depravity and pollution. And whether our Lord actually entered this district or only approached its confines is a matter of dispute." But then if you read Mark's Gospel and look at chapter 7 and verse 21, he tells us plainly that Jesus went through Sidon to get back to the Sea of Galilee. So, on balance, there seems little doubt that Jesus actually did visit Sidon at least, if not Tyre as well. But if Tyre and Sidon were ungodly Gentile cities, and also Jesus is constantly saying that he's only come for the lost sheep of Israel, that begs the question, what was he doing in the area of these two ungodly cities in the first place? Now, the main reason Jesus went there, I would suggest, can be deduced from looking at the word translated as withdraw. And that word is, here we go, anakoreo, which is defined as to go back or to withdraw. And it's used to indicate I return, I retire, I withdraw, or I depart. underlying perhaps the idea of taking refuge from danger and going into retirement. So the truth is, Jesus is likely to have been making a tactical withdrawal here. After such an acrimonious confrontation with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, he would have been anxious to avoid any possibility of him being killed prematurely. And so he's just got right out of the way. McLaren says this in his commentary: the King of Israel has passed beyond the bounds of Israel, driven by the hostility of those who should have been his subjects. The delegates of the priestly party from Jerusalem, who had come down to see into this dangerous enthusiasm which was bringing him into Galilee, have made Christ's withdrawal expedient. And he goes northward, if not actually into the territory of Tyre and Sidon, at any rate to the borderlands. And the pulpit commentary says this: Jesus left the place, probably Capernaum, where the above discourse had been held and where it was no longer safe for him to remain. He had grievously offended the dominant party by his outspoken words concerning purity and defilement. Therefore, to escape any premature violence, he departed to a more secure quarter, into the coasts of Tyre and Sidon. The word coasts here, in verse 22, does not mean sea coasts, but borders. The Authorized Version conveys a wrong impression by its use of the word. So it's likely that Jesus went into the general area of the two cities at this particular time, driven by the need to keep a low profile, as we'd say today. And this idea is backed up by Mark, who tells us in his gospel that Jesus entered a house and didn't want anyone to know about it. And we don't read of him going into any of the towns or cities. We don't read of him teaching crowds here. He just wanted to escape attention for a while and lie low. It's rather ironic that Galilee, which should have been friendly territory to Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, proved hostile because of the influence of the Pharisees and the scribes. Tyre and Sidon, which should have been hostile to Christ, given the history between them and God's people, would be much friendlier to him. There we will see people responded far more readily in faith to Jesus than the Jews did. Now, we read further on that his plan to escape attention didn't quite work out, because Matthew tells us that while he was there, a Canaanite woman seeks him out. And Matthew makes it obvious that she is in some distress and quite desperate. She cries out to Jesus for help, calling him the Son of David. Now that in itself is quite a remarkable thing if she was a Gentile. For a Gentile to be calling Jesus the Son of David, that is quite a remarkable thing in itself. But it also tells us that somehow word has got around that he's there. Because otherwise, how would she have known that he was there and where to find him? Son of David was a messianic title, and the use of it by the Canaanite woman tells us that not only has she heard of Jesus, but she believes what Jesus says about himself, and that she has complete confidence that Jesus can heal her daughter. Otherwise, she wouldn't have gone to him. She's appealing to Jesus for help. She explains that her daughter is suffering terribly from demon possession. That's me reading ahead. Strangely enough, Jesus doesn't do anything. He doesn't answer a word. He just ignores her completely, seemingly. Eventually, it's the disciples that tell Jesus to send her away. Jesus replies that he was only sent to the lost people, the lost sheep of Israel. But the woman persists. She kneels before Jesus saying, "Help me, please." You know, this kind of reminds me of the parable of the woman who goes to the judge, the desperate, and keeps pestering and pestering and pestering and pestering. And the judge says, "I'm going to give her what she wants, just so that she doesn't wear me out with her pestering." This woman is along the same lines. She knows Jesus can help, and she's not going away until he does. And when Jesus does react, what he says can seem to be a little bit unpleasant and condescending. He says it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Now, she could have taken offense at that, but she obviously didn't, because her reply straight away is that even the dogs eat what has fallen from the table. And that tells us that not only has she got a sharp mind to come up with a reply like that straight away, but it also reinforces her faith in Jesus, in who he is and what he can do. I suspect that when Jesus said this, he was testing her. He just wanted to see if she'd take offense and get up and go away. He was just waiting to see what the reaction was. And her reaction was, she's not going away. I'm going nowhere until you help me. When she said, help me, and Jesus said nothing, we don't really know how long that silence went on for. We don't know how long Jesus would have kept up that silence for if the disciples hadn't have intervened. It could have been a few seconds. It could have been minutes. But eventually the disciples get bored with all this and said, for goodness sake, send her away. She keeps crying out after us. Yep, exactly. It's amazing what a parent will do for their child. The Reverend R.T. France says this: send her away. The same verb in Luke 2:29 applies to a dismissal with desire satisfied. David Guzik said it's likely that the disciples meant send her away by giving her what she wants. It's entirely possible that they just wanted her to go away, and the easiest way to achieve that was for Jesus to fix a problem. In other words, Jesus could have said, in today's language, and I'm paraphrasing, for goodness sake, Jesus, heal her daughter and get her out the way. Not only is this woman persistent, but her dialogue with Jesus tells us, all these years later, of her absolute belief that Jesus can help her. And Jesus was impressed with her faith. And that's perhaps the reason why he kept quiet. He wanted to see whether she'd give up and go away. If he said nothing for long enough, is she going to get tired and go away and leave him alone? He was testing her faith. And the fact that the disciples said, she keeps crying out after us, shows that she was persistent. She didn't go away. She kept on and on and on and on. And she was going to keep on at Jesus until she got what she wanted. And she gets what she wanted. From that moment, her daughter was healed. And again, that's an expression of faith as well, because it's likely her daughter wasn't with her. And so she's got no way of knowing that her daughter was healed, for sure. It's just that Jesus has said, your daughter is healed. And she takes him at his word and goes. That is astonishing faith. I mean, I don't suppose you'd find too many people with that much faith in the church today, in this world. Yeah. 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 Amen. Yeah.
So he sold the
Yeah. Absolutely. Perhaps that demonstration was for the disciples' benefit as well, as much as anything else. Yes. You do, indeed. Yep.
very specific there.
Yep.
In all the translations, it says only to the sheep, and that in contrast to the use of the word dog.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, like, what the significance of that difference between only to the sheep and then the reference to dogs is.
I think calling Gentiles dogs was a common thing back in Jesus' day. It was like a nickname for them, if you like. And so although it might sound derogatory to us, it probably wasn't sounding that bad to them, because that's what they called people. It's the same as Welsh people are called taff, if you like, and Scots people are called jock, you know. It's just a little bit more derogatory to call Gentiles dogs, but that's just the way it was back in the day. But you could be right. Perhaps Jesus did mention the lost sheep of Israel on purpose. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think he probably knew that he obviously knew that the gospel was going to spread, and eventually the Gentiles were going to be incorporated as well, and that's probably why he wasn't beyond helping the odd Gentile that came to him with genuine faith. Yeah, as I'm making this behave at the moment, I am listening. Keep going.
Miracles and healing power, but she sought after him, and it's fairly common in the throughout the book that all who seek will find.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's just what came into my head, was all who seek will find. But she was determined that she was going to go away with an answer.
Absolutely, yeah. And she's obviously heard of Jesus in the past, somehow or another, and she believes what she's heard. He did, indeed he did, yes. It's difficult to say, because not all the Gospels put things in chronological order. So yeah, so. Okay, so going on from there, we've seen how Jesus went to the region of Tyre and Sidon because he wanted to lay low for a while. But let's be honest, Israel, Judah's a big place. He could have done that anywhere. He could have gone up into a mountain or hidden in a valley or somewhere. I wonder, when I read this, if he chose the region of Tyre and Sidon to lay low because he knew in his spirit there was somebody there who needed his help. Yeah. So I'm convinced in my mind that Jesus knew that there was somebody up there who needed his help. And he's gone there perhaps to give that person a chance to come and see him, to get that help. Okay, let's read verses 29 to 31. Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up on a mountain and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame and the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. Amen. So after spending time in the region of these two Gentile cities, Jesus goes back to the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And once again, Mark provides us with more information as to where Jesus went. He tells us that Jesus went to the Sea of Galilee and into the Decapolis. Now, Capernaum is on the west or the left side of the Sea of Galilee. And Tyre and Sidon were on the, sorry, I got that wrong. Tyre and Sidon are on the Mediterranean coast. Capernaum is on the opposite side. It was a long walk from where Jesus went to the Decapolis, right around the top and right down to the far side of the Sea of Galilee. I wonder what happened if they got arthritis in those days. That would kind of scupper things a bit, wouldn't it, if you couldn't really walk that far? It's no wonder you didn't see many fat people around in those days, the amount of walking they did. Barclay says this: one of the difficulties about the Gospels is that they do not give us any definite indication of times and dates. These we have to work out for ourselves, using such hints as the story may give us. When we do, we find that Jesus' period of retirement with his disciples was very much longer than we might think of from a casual reading of the story. When Jesus fed the 5,000, it was springtime, because at no other time would the grass have been green in that hot and arid land. After his discussions with the scribes and Pharisees, he withdrew to the districts of Tyre and Sidon. That itself is no small journey on foot. Then he returns from Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, to the region of the Decapolis. This was a strange way of traveling, because Sidon is north of Tyre. The Sea of Galilee is south of Tyre. And the Decapolis, as you know, a confederation of 10 Greek cities on the east side or the right-hand side of the Sea of Galilee. So that's to say, Jesus went north in order to go south. It's as if you imagine a triangle. He went from that point in the triangle to that point by going up north instead of going straight across. Now it's clear that Jesus deliberately lengthened this journey to have as long a time as possible with his disciples before the last journey to Jerusalem. This northern journey, they say, took Jesus perhaps 6 months altogether. We know nothing about what happened in the course of those months, but we can be perfectly sure that they were probably the most important 6 months through which the disciples ever lived. And in that 6 months, Jesus would have deliberately taught and instructed them to make sure they were ready for what he knew was coming. He opened their minds to the truth. It's quite a thing when you think that basically Jesus only had this 6 months alone with his disciples before this testing time came about on them. But when he arrives in the area, he goes up to a mountain and sits down. Now we read a great crowd came to him. And this time, not out of any sense of curiosity or listen to him speak. They came for one reason only, and that was healing. And they brought to Jesus everybody who needed healing. The sick and the lame, all they were fetched. I imagine when Jesus and his disciples arrived in the area, perhaps somebody saw him and told family and friends, who told friends, who told friends. And you know what the jungle drums are like? It's gone out through everywhere. The news spreads like wildfire. And the next thing, great crowds are flocking to Jesus. Having heard of the previous miracles that he's performed in Galilee, they bring in everybody who needs healing to Jesus. And you know, unlike previous times, they don't even bother to ask Jesus to heal them. They just bring them and plonk them at his feet in expectation. And their expectations are met. They see the lame walking, they see the blind seeing, they see all manner of illnesses cured. They are amazed and they praise the God of Israel. And don't forget, we're in the Decapolis here. So these are mainly Gentile people. And they're praising the God of Israel. It's a sad state of affairs when God's own people are less inclined to accept who he is than the ungodly people living around. But even though they came primarily to bring their sick for healing, they must have been captivated by Jesus speaking to them. Because we read from Jesus himself that they stayed with him for 3 days. And at the end of this time, Jesus tells his disciples that he has compassion on them. In other words, he really feels for them. Kaufman says this: the unusual circumstance was that for a period of 3 whole days and nights, Jesus had engaged in one continuous healing service. The throngs would not leave as long as there was a chance of others being healed. Food could wait, and it did. This was a powerful testimony to the ability and the extent of Jesus' work among the Gentiles on the fringes of Israel. Compassion and pity in the heart of Jesus were evident in all of his works. Now Jesus, knowing they have no food, calls his disciples to him. This suggests that they were dispersed among the crowds, possibly ministering and teaching themselves. And he tells the disciples he doesn't want to send them away with empty stomachs, in case. Let's pick it up at verse 32. Jesus calls his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. His disciples answered, where could we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied, and a few small fish. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground, and then he took the loaves and the flesh and the fish, and when he had given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and they returned to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and afterwards the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of people who ate was 4,000, besides women and children. And after Jesus had sent the crowd away, he got in the boat and went to the vicinity of Magadan. So Jesus didn't actually tell his disciples to go and get food. It might have been a thinly veiled hint in what he said. The disciples were quick enough to reply, where can we get enough bread to feed all these people? In today's language, they might have said, you're having a laugh. We're in the middle of nowhere. Where are we going to get bread to feed all these people? We haven't got enough for us, let alone for them. So Jesus asks how much food they have. I'm sure he was aware pretty much of how much was around to start with. But they bring him 7 loaves and a few small fish. And as before, Jesus tells his disciples to get the people seated on the ground. And as before, he gives thanks and he breaks the food. And he dishes it out amongst the crowd. Matthew tells us they all ate and were satisfied, and that they collected 7 baskets full of leftovers. Apparently there were 4,000 people there, plus the women and children. Now Barclays makes a comment here that many scholars think that the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000 are different versions of the same incident, but that is not so. For a start, the date is different. The first took place in the spring. We know this because Jesus told the 5,000 to sit on the grass, and the only time grass is green in that region is in the spring. The second is in the summer because Jesus told the 4,000 to sit on the ground. No mention of grass. The people and the place are different. The feeding of the 5,000 took place in Galilee, and the people were Jews. The feeding of the 4,000 took place in the Decapolis, and on this occasion there would be many Gentiles present, perhaps more Gentiles than Jews. So he says. This explains why we read they glorified the God of Israel. Because they weren't Jewish exactly. In addition to this, Barclay makes in his commentary the following observation. There is another curious little hint of difference. In the feeding of the 5,000, the baskets which were used to take up the fragments are called kophinoi. In the feeding of the 4,000, they are called spurides. The first one was a narrow-necked, flask-shaped basket which Jews often carried with them, for a Jew often carried his own food, lest he would be compelled to eat food which had been touched by Gentile hands and was therefore unclean. The spurius was much more like a hamper. It could be big enough to carry a man and was the kind of basket that the Gentiles would have used. And Alfred Edersheim, who was a 19th century Jewish convert to Christianity and a Bible scholar, made the following observation. In his writings, he points out that in 3 successive stages of his ministry, Jesus ended each stage by setting a meal before the people. First, there was the feeding of the 5,000 that came at the end of his ministry in Galilee, but Jesus was never to teach and preach and heal in Galilee again. Second, there was this feeding of the 4,000. This came at the end of his brief ministry to the Gentiles beyond the bounds of Palestine, first in the districts of Tyre and Sidon, and then in the Decapolis. And the third and last, there was the Last Supper in Jerusalem, when Jesus came to the final stages of the days in his flesh. After Jesus has dismissed the crowd, he and his disciples get into a boat and head for Magadan. Now, there's a fair bit of confusion as to where this is. Matthew says Magadan, Mark says Dalmanutha. The most common description for the place is provided by Barnes. Coasts of Magdala, Mark says. The parts of Dalmanutha, Magdala was probably the same place which was formerly called Migdol. See Joshua 19:38. It is now called Mejdel, and is situated a few miles north of the city of Tiberias in the land of Gennesaret, on the western side of the Sea of Tiberias and directly east of Canaan and Galilee. At this point, Barnes quotes Thompson from his book, The Land and the Book. He says, it is a wretched hamlet of a dozen low huts huddled into one, and the whole ready to tumble into a dismal heap of black basaltic rubbish. Barnes goes on to say that this was the birthplace of Mary Magdalene, out of whom the Saviour cast 7 devils. Dalmanutha was probably a small village near to Magdala, of which no remains have been discovered. There is no contradiction in the statements of the 2 evangelists here, for they do not say Jesus went to either of these towns, but only the coasts or parts where they are situated. And I'm going to end it for tonight because that's the end of chapter 15.